Alright, hello guys. On the topic, like this video's topic is gonna talk about something in Mystcraft, which has been there for since the 1.7.10 edition and before, and will most likely still be there in the 1.12 update. It's something that has given server owners a lot of grief that worked with Mystcraft, and so today I want to talk about why it exists and why it cannot really be removed, or well, while it cannot be removed, there are ways to combat that, and yeah, so that's what I want to talk about. And in essence, it's the baseline profiling of Mystcraft. So you know, when you start up Mystcraft for the first time in a world, you get the small pop-up that basically says, quote-unquote, Mystcraft is baking a cake, which in the end means that in the background there is a world being generated with a bunch of chunks in it that will be profiled. So it will log all the blocks that are generated and count the blocks that are generated and caches them and creates, in the end, when enough chunks are generated, the average of specific blocks, and thus calculates the instability of those blocks. So it goes over all biomes there are, and the more different biomes you have in your pack, the longer this will take, / the more chunks will be generated. Now, why is the instability calculation in the end important for a specific pack? Well, not every pack is the same, and not every combination of chunks make a pack the same. So let's say you have, well, whatever. What's a good example? I believe the Deep Dark and so on, or at least in 1.7.10 had a higher rate of ores than the overworld does. So Mystcraft assumes that for the biome, the biome that the Deep Dark is, there is just going to be a whole lot more ores spawning. So overall, the instability a specific ore gives will drop overall, because there are more ways, well, in essence more biomes, that would allow you to get ores. And thus, for example, the instability of a single, let's say, emerald ore, or a higher quantity of emerald ores, will then end up giving a Mystcraft world much less instability. Because, well, Mystcraft concluded that ores are overall more common. So let's say you now have a pack that almost disables all ore generation entirely, except one ore which generates very rarely. So then Mystcraft in the end recognizes that certain ores or certain things didn't generate at all. And one ore, even though it generated, is very, very rare. So Mystcraft concludes that if there is a Mystcraft world that ends up having a bunch of these ores, it will get very, very unstable, because those ores are supposed to be very rare and very hard to get. So Mystcraft adjusts to whatever pack environment it is in. And that's where the baseline profiling is very important, to allow Mystcraft to adjust to whatever environment it is thrown in. Now normally that shouldn't take, too long. It should take a couple minutes at most. And after that it's basically done and you don't have to do it again. It will occur again if the pack itself changes. So if mods are being exchanged, thrown out, or updated, and so on, Mystcraft will recognize that and mark the previous profiling invalid, since the pack has changed, so something has changed, so the ore generation might be different. Now from Mystcraft's perspective, it cannot really recognize if a mod adds something to worldgen now or doesn't, or tweaked its numbers internally. So Mystcraft doesn't know that. Respectively, it cannot recognize if you're editing some mod's config while the pack remains the same and thus worldgen changes. Mystcraft cannot capture that. So in the end, in essence, profiling attempts to well, adjust a bit to the pack without the pack developer herself needs to do a whole lot. Now this can work or can't work, depending if the pack gets larger or smaller. Because, well, as the past has shown, if you're playing in a very, very big pack, then you have lots of biomes, lots of different blocks, lots of structures that are being generated, and those are obviously also generated in the profiling dimension. So you end up with a whole lot of things that are all generated at once in a very, very, well, awkward place, because you also might end up throwing a bunch of biomes all over the place, since the biome it selects to be profiled is random. So let's just assume you've put in, well, Galacticraft or any other like space type mod, which adds a whole bunch of biomes which are very, very specific in their generation, very, very specific in their ore distribution or, well, block generation and so on. You get the point. So in the end, there might be biomes like a Venus biome right next to a kind of rare Mars biome next to a jungle biome and so on. So the biomes are in the end all mixed up, which isn't really a problem since every chunk should be not dependent on the chunks next to it. It's procedurally generated world, which like is not real, shouldn't be really dependent on that. There are exceptions, of course, and well, will end up being a bit messy, I suppose. The overall result is that things can break and things can take longer than expected, so we ended up having a huge TPS impact for a couple hours and baselining still didn't finish properly, which is not the goal of this, and there are systems in place that would normally prevent that. However, they can also only do so much, or can only account for so much. So in the end, that might not work out properly. So what one can do is, instead of having to grieve over the baselining and essentially have every player grieve over the baselining once they try to play the pack, a pack maker can supply a predefined instability file, which basically already defines instabilities for certain blocks and so on. So in the end, you don't really have to run the instability or baseline profiling to actually get Mystcraft to work properly with your pack. Now mind you, if you're adjusting any rarities or any vault generation, that file doesn't change. Because once you set Mystcraft to use your pre-filled baseline instability, it will use that. And if you change the pack, Mystcraft doesn't care. So, well, you should, if you use those configurations, also keep them up to date in case you're changing the pack, because Mystcraft will then no longer adjust itself. Now that being said, that is the huge upside, so you're no longer actually needing to do baseline profiling and or neither do your pack players. How that is done is defined in the Mystcraft config, and yeah, should be kind of straightforward from there on. So yeah, that was basically just a short information video about profiling. Well, profiling is needed and what you can do to make it a bit more bearable, and or some options that will allow you to either not do baseline profiling at all or only do it once so you can get all the necessary values and then fill your pre-defined or pre-filled instability configurations. So then your, well, pack players don't need to do that anymore.